The late afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of the old workshop, casting long golden beams across the worn wooden floor. Thomas Walker stood quietly at the entrance, the familiar scent of sawdust and engine oil wrapping around him like a warm, heavy coat. He ran his fingers along the edge of an old workbench, each nick and groove a memory etched in time. For over 30 years, this had been his sanctuary. A place of sweat, patience, and craftsmanship. Where wood met steel, and dreams became furniture, tools, even toys. Where he taught his now-grown son, Eric, how to hold a hammer, how to listen to the grain of wood, and how to finish what he started. But Eric hadn't set foot here in years. Thomas wasn't bitter. At least that's what he told himself. His hands, though slower now, still remembered. He came here daily, not to build, but to be near what he loved. The workshop had outlasted his marriage, survived economic downturns, and stood strong even when his body began to fail him in quiet, invisible ways. In one corner stood a half-finished rocking chair, a project he started long ago for a grandchild who never arrived. Nearby, an old oil-stained apron hung on the wall, untouched, like a flag of past labor. Thomas sat in his old creaky chair, a thermos of lukewarm coffee in hand, and closed his eyes. The world outside moved fast now. Too fast. His workshop was the last place that still honored slowness, precision, and care. He didn't know yet that the world outside was about to come crashing in. But for now, the workshop breathed with him, slow, steady, alive. It still belonged to him. And in its quiet corners, it still held secrets no one else knew. The knock came late in the morning, crisp and confident. Thomas opened the front door to find Eric standing there, dressed in his usual city clothes, pressed shirt, blazer, polished shoes that had never seen a workshop floor. "Morning, Dad," Eric said, flashing that business world smile. The kind that never reached his eyes. Thomas stepped aside without a word and gestured him in. They didn't hug. They hadn't in years. Eric glanced around the small living room, his nose wrinkling slightly at the faint smell of varnish and coffee. "Still keeping the place the same, huh?" Thomas grunted. "It still works." Eric chuckled. "Well, that's what I wanted to talk about." Thomas stiffened. He knew that tone, slick, rehearsed, the tone Eric used when pitching deals or discussing numbers. "I've been talking to some developers," Eric continued. "They're interested in the land out back, the workshop. It's an old structure, not really worth anything anymore. But the location is prime. They're thinking condos. Or maybe a wellness center. Something upscale." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "It's not for sale," he said simply. Eric nodded slowly, like he expected the answer. "I figured you'd say that. But Dad, you're not using it. It's just sitting there, gathering dust." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "It's mine. And it's not just dust in there." Eric gave a tight smile. "Of course. I get it. Sentimental value. But think about the future. You could use that money for something meaningful. Travel, comfort, retirement." Thomas shook his head. "That workshop is the reason I had anything to retire from." Eric exhaled, irritated. "You're being stubborn." "No," Thomas said, voice low and firm. "I'm remembering who I am." Silence stretched between them. Two men from the same blood, standing on opposite sides of values they no longer shared. Eric straightened his blazer, smoothing invisible wrinkles. "Fine. Just think about it." Thomas didn't answer. He just turned and walked toward the kitchen. Eric watched him go, and behind that polished exterior, something cold and calculating flickered in his eyes. He wasn't done yet. 3 weeks later, Thomas returned home from a weekend trip to visit an old friend in another town. He hadn't been away from the property for more than a day in years, but James had insisted. "You need a break from that workshop," he'd said. Thomas agreed, though reluctantly. A few days to catch up, laugh about the past, play cards like they used to. But as he turned onto his street that Sunday afternoon, a strange feeling crawled into his chest. His truck slowed as he approached the driveway. Something was wrong. The workshop, his workshop, looked different. Gone were the faded signs, the familiar tools hanging from the window, even the small garden patch where he'd planted lavender to keep bugs away. The door was padlocked with a fresh silver lock. A sign hung from a metal stake out front. Sold. Future site of Ridgeway Properties. Thomas froze. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He pulled over, stepped out, and walked to the building in a daze. He knocked on the door, though he knew no one would answer. He tried the lock. Solid. The windows had been wiped clean, a cold, corporate shine replacing years of character. He stood there for several minutes, staring. A neighbor approached. "Thomas, I didn't think you knew yet," she said gently. "Some men came on Friday. Took photos. Did measurements." "Who sold it?" he asked, though he already knew. "Your son. At least, that's what the men said." Thomas's jaw tightened. He nodded once and walked back to his truck. Inside the cab, he sat for a long time. His breath steady, controlled. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. But something inside him clicked, like the sound of a lathe locking into place. Eric had betrayed him. And Eric thought it was over. But it wasn't. The following morning, Thomas unlocked the old shed behind the house, a structure that looked like it might collapse with a stiff breeze, but which had always stood firm, just like its owner. Inside, under a heavy canvas tarp, was an old filing cabinet. Rusted, dented, and full of history. He pulled open the second drawer, the one no one ever bothered with. Inside were blueprints, deeds, newspaper clippings, and tucked between folders, a small wooden box. He opened it, revealing a bundle of letters tied with twine, their paper yellowed and edges curled. These weren't love letters. They were correspondences between him and his late brother, a lawyer, written nearly 3 decades ago. Together, they had worked out a deal with the city to preserve historical sites in their county. As a result, the workshop had been granted partial historical protection, meaning it could not be torn down, altered, or sold without multiple legal verifications, including Thomas's explicit written consent. And that consent had never been given. Thomas took a deep breath. The betrayal still burned, but now it had edges, outlines of a response forming in his mind. He placed the letters in a leather pouch and carefully folded the legal documents into a manila envelope. From the wall, he removed a faded photo of himself and Eric, when his son was 10, holding their first wooden birdhouse together. The image hurt now, but he still tucked it into the envelope. Later that afternoon, he made a call to Claire Dorsey, a local attorney who had once been his apprentice, back when she was just a teenager with paint under her fingernails and too many questions about joinery. She remembered him immediately. "Thomas Walker? Of course. What do you need?" "Advice," he said. "And maybe some justice." They met at a quiet cafe downtown, where Thomas laid out the documents, the letters, the legal groundwork. Claire's eyes widened as she read through the contents. "This is solid. If the developer acted on forged documents, and your signature wasn't legally verified, the sale can be reversed. And your son." Thomas nodded slowly. "He doesn't need jail. He needs to understand what he threw away." Claire's face softened. "We can stop the demolition. The city would be liable if they went forward without a clear chain of title. Do you want to go public?" Thomas considered that for a long moment, then shook his head. "No. I don't want headlines. I want my workshop. And I want my son to look me in the eye and realize what he lost." Claire leaned back. "Then let's make sure that happens." That evening, Thomas returned home and walked to the workshop's locked door. He ran his fingers across the cold padlock. It was strange, seeing his life boxed and sealed like someone else's property. But he wasn't done. He had more than just memories inside those walls. He had something his son never understood. Legacy. The next few days passed in quiet preparation. Thomas was a man of craft, not chaos. every move he made was with purpose. He revisited the old toolshed, oiling the hinges on the drawers, cleaning out dust from shelves, and restoring the papers to clear folders and files. But the past wasn't just paper. It lived in the wood itself. Behind the shelves, under the floorboards, embedded in the beams, Thomas had spent a lifetime building more than furniture. He had hidden things too. Sketches, stories, one-of-a-kind designs that had never left the room. His true legacy wasn't what he had sold, but what he had saved. Each piece held a fingerprint. Each carving a whisper. He hadn't just built chairs. He had built memory. On Thursday, Claire returned with paperwork in hand, an official motion to freeze the transaction between Ridgway Properties and Eric Walker, citing fraud and improper authorization of deed transfer. "They're going to be furious," she said, sliding the documents across his dining table. Thomas nodded. "Let them be. Anger's easy. Respect is earned." That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Thomas walked through the workshop one more time. The moonlight spilled through the high windows, catching on old chisels and clamps like a silent choir of stars. He could almost hear his younger self here, laughing, learning, sanding. He reached into the far wall, a panel disguised as decoration, and pulled out a velvet-lined box. Inside was a miniature ship, hand-carved, sails made from fabric scraps of his late wife's apron. It was the first thing he ever made, as a boy, under his father's guidance. He had shown it to Eric once. Eric had scoffed. Now, Thomas held it like a compass. The next morning, the letter arrived. Thick paper. Gold embossed. An invitation from Ridgway Properties to a site celebration, scheduled for Monday, Demolition Day. Thomas smiled and tucked it into his coat. He didn't go alone. On Monday, Claire stood beside him at the construction gate. Reporters had caught wind of the freeze order and were there too, cameras in hand. A few neighbors gathered behind the yellow tape. Then Eric pulled up. He stepped out, all polished arrogance, only to freeze when he saw his father standing in front of the gate, arms crossed. "What is this?" Eric demanded. "A reminder," Thomas said. "That blood doesn't make you immune to consequence. I didn't forge your name. You didn't ask for it, either." Claire stepped forward. "The sale has been blocked. Your buyers can't proceed. You'll be hearing from the city." Eric flushed, jaw clenched. "You're ruining everything." Thomas shook his head. "No, son. You already did that. I'm just making sure it doesn't stay ruined." Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned in. Eric turned and stormed back to his car. Thomas didn't watch him go. He turned instead toward the workshop. Toward home. The next week unfolded like the slow unraveling of a tightly wound spring. Ridgway Properties attempted to push through the sale anyway, arguing ignorance, but Claire was relentless. With the preservation documents now in public record and the court's injunction firmly in place, there was no loophole to exploit. Every call, every email from the developers became more desperate and less courteous. Eric, meanwhile, went silent. No texts. No visits. No more suits pulling into the driveway uninvited. It was as if his polished world had cracked, and he didn't know what to do with the pieces. Thomas didn't seek him out. He kept to the workshop, now legally, and spiritually, his again. Every morning, he brewed his coffee, unlocked the door, and stepped into a space that no longer felt threatened. He sanded old tabletops, reorganized drawers, even finished the rocking chair he'd once abandoned. There was peace in woodwork. In repetition. In the slow, satisfying return of control. One afternoon, as golden sunlight spilled across the floorboards, he found something behind an old chest, a drawing Eric had made as a boy, a clumsy sketch of a treehouse, all crooked lines and smudged corners. Thomas had once promised they'd build it together. They never did. He sat down and stared at it for a long time. Then, carefully, he pinned it to the wall beside his father's ship. That evening, a knock came at the back door. It was tentative, uncertain. Eric. No blazer. No shine. Just jeans and a sweatshirt, and a face that had clearly not slept well in days. Thomas opened the door but didn't speak. "I didn't know," Eric began, voice hoarse. I didn't bother to know. I thought it was just a building." Thomas said nothing. Eric looked around the workshop, his eyes moving from tool to tool, finally landing on the rocking chair. "You're still making things." "I never stopped," Thomas said quietly. A pause. Then, "I was trying to fix things, in my own way. Make money, help with stuff. But I didn't ask. I didn't think about what this place means." Thomas crossed his arms. "You didn't think about what I mean." Eric swallowed hard. "I know." Silence settled between them, thick, but not hostile. Thomas looked at his son. "You can't fix this with an apology." "I know that too. But you can help me sand down this frame," Thomas said, gesturing to a table near the back. Eric blinked. "You want me to? Only if you're ready to do it right." Slowly, Eric stepped forward, picked up the sanding block, ran it gently across the wood. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. And in the quiet rhythm of sanding, side by side, father and son, something old began to take root again. The following days felt different, softer, quieter. Eric showed up every morning around 8. He didn't knock. He just let himself into the workshop like he used to when he was a boy. He didn't speak much, and Thomas didn't push. They simply worked, side by side, like two carpenters building something invisible between them. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with sawdust, memory, and something slowly mending. Eric began asking questions. Real ones. About wood grain. About why his father angled the plane a certain way. Why one type of varnish darkened with age and another didn't. Thomas answered every time, calmly, patiently, without bitterness. One afternoon, Eric set down his sanding block and rolled his sore wrist. "How did you do this every day for 40 years?" he asked. Thomas looked at the half-sanded beam. "I didn't," he said. "Some days I just sat and listened to the wood." Eric chuckled. "That's not a real answer." "It is," Thomas replied. "You just don't understand it yet." Later that week, Claire stopped by. The court had officially voided the property sale. Ridgeway Properties had quietly withdrawn, preferring to cut their losses rather than face legal and public backlash. The workshop was safe. Permanently. Claire smiled as she handed Thomas the finalized documents. "You won," she said. Thomas shook her hand. "We kept what mattered. That's not the same as winning." Before she left, he gave her a small box, cookies he'd made from his late wife's old recipe. Claire laughed. "Still building trust the old-fashioned way?" He smiled. "The only way I know." That night, Thomas returned to the workshop alone. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and old varnish. He opened a small wooden chest in the corner, untouched for years. Inside were brittle photographs, old receipts, and a leather-bound notebook filled with blueprints, scribbled thoughts, and quotes from his mentors. Near the middle, one page had words printed in bold, block handwriting. "A man is measured not by what he builds, but by what he leaves standing." He stared at that sentence for a long time. His gaze wandered across the room, tools lined up perfectly, shelves full of aged timber, unfinished projects waiting patiently. And then to Eric. Asleep on the old bench, still wearing his work clothes, his head resting against a folded jacket. In sleep, Eric looked like the boy Thomas remembered, not the man who'd betrayed him. Thomas picked up a blanket from a nearby chair and draped it gently over his son's shoulders. Then he sat down again, the quote still echoing in his mind. He didn't know how much time he had left. But maybe that wasn't the point. Because what truly mattered was that something still stood. The workshop. The bond. The legacy, scarred, sanded, but never thrown away. Spring crept in slowly that year, like it was holding its breath. The mornings were still cool, but the light had changed, warmer, longer, softer. The air smelled of sawdust and blooming lilacs from the neighbor's garden. In the workshop, time ticked by not on clocks, but by the rhythm of chisels and brushes, of silence broken by quiet conversation. Eric had stopped checking his phone. He used to glance at it constantly. Messages, calls, alerts from the office. Now it lay face down in the corner, forgotten. He arrived early, left late, and the suits had disappeared entirely from his wardrobe. He had started a new project. A table, wide, sturdy, imperfect. His first. Thomas guided him, but never corrected unless asked. It was hard for Eric. His hands were clumsy, the joints uneven, the measurements off. But he didn't give up. One evening, as golden light poured in through the dusty windows, he stood back from the frame and sighed. "It's not square," he muttered. Thomas glanced up. "Neither was your first birdhouse. You were 8. You called it a fortress." Eric smiled faintly. "You still have it." Thomas pointed toward the shelf in the back. There it was. Crooked, faded, still standing. Eric chuckled. "Guess I never learned straight lines." Thomas set down his brush. "Straight lines are overrated. They don't leave room for story." That night, they ate dinner together, not in silence, not in tension, but in the gentle warmth of two people relearning each other. Eric asked questions about his mother, about the early days of the shop, about things he'd ignored when he was too busy chasing a life he thought he wanted. "She used to bring you soup," Thomas said, smiling. "You'd pretend not to like it, but you always finished the bowl." "I didn't deserve her," Eric murmured. Thomas met his eyes. "You were a child. She knew you'd grow." They sat a while longer, talking, remembering. The kind of conversation they had never shared when life was loud and pride was taller than love. Later that week, Eric arrived holding something wrapped in cloth. "What's that?" Thomas asked. Eric unwrapped it, a photo frame. Inside was a picture of Thomas and his wife, taken on the day they opened the workshop. Young. Smiling. Hopeful. Eric had restored the photo, framed it with leftover walnut from the table he was building. "I wanted it to be part of this place again," he said. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped to the back wall and cleared a small spot, gently hanging the photo near the window where the light hit just right. When he turned back, Eric looked unsure, almost nervous. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. "Not for the frame. Not for the photo. For everything." The next morning, Thomas found a note on the bench. "I'll be late today. I'm picking up something important. Don't start without me." He smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt something strange and simple settle in his chest. Hope. It was nearing noon when Eric returned. Thomas had been working steadily all morning, carefully fitting dovetail joints into a drawer. The smell of cedar hung thick in the air, and the only sound was the scrape of wood and the soft hum of an old jazz record spinning in the corner. When the workshop door creaked open, Thomas didn't look up immediately. But the quiet pause that followed made him lift his eyes. Eric stood there with a crate in his arms. "Found it," he said, slightly breathless. He set the crate down and pulled back the cloth cover. Inside were 3 old carving tools, worn, wooden-handled, but unmistakably familiar. They had belonged to Thomas's father. He had believed them lost for good. "I tracked down the guy who bought them from the estate auction after Grandpa passed," Eric explained. "He kept them in a display case for 20 years. Said he'd only sell them to family." Thomas stepped closer and picked up one of the tools, a thin gouge with a chipped horn handle. He ran his fingers over the grip like it was a handshake across time. "Thank you," he whispered. Eric shrugged. "Felt like they should be here. Not behind glass." For a moment, Thomas couldn't speak. The weight of the gesture, of recognition, of effort, of care, settled deeper than anything words could reach. That afternoon, they cleared a new shelf in the workshop. Not for storage. For history. The tools went up next to the framed photo of Thomas and his wife, next to the birdhouse fortress, next to the folded drawing of the unfinished treehouse. Together, they were creating more than just furniture. They were curating a life. Later, Claire visited again, this time not as a lawyer, but as a friend. She brought sandwiches and lemonade, and sat with them at Eric's almost finished table. "This place feels different," she said, glancing around the sunlit room. "Like it's breathing again." Thomas nodded. "Because we stopped trying to replace the past, and started honoring it." Eric glanced at his father, surprised. But it was true. He could feel it too. The ache was still there, the memory of betrayal, the loss of time, the things unsaid, but it no longer ruled the room. They talked for hours. About plans. About rebuilding not just wood but community. Eric had quietly reached out to local artisans, proposing a workshop series, a way to bring in young people, pass down skills, give the space a future beyond just the two of them. Thomas had been skeptical at first. But he had agreed. "It's time," he'd said. "Time this place became more than just mine." The next week, the first group arrived, 3 teenagers, 2 retired veterans, and a woman in her 50s who wanted to learn how to build a bookshelf for her daughter's wedding. Thomas watched as Eric greeted them all at the door, guiding them through safety instructions, showing them around, introducing them to each corner like they were being welcomed into a cathedral. He stood back, arms crossed, and smiled. This was the legacy. Not the wood. Not the tools. Not the building. But what it became when people believed in it again. The first workshop ended just before sunset. The room was filled with the low thrum of voices, the scraping of saws being cleaned, and soft laughter. A few of the teenagers were showing off the wooden boxes they'd made, clumsy but proud, while the older guests carefully wrapped their finished pieces in cloth and twine. Thomas didn't hover. He just observed. He saw Eric smiling, not forced, not stiff, but real. The kind of smile he hadn't seen in decades. He watched as Eric gently corrected a boy's grip on a hand plane, then clapped a veteran on the shoulder as the man finished sanding down a near-perfect dovetail. That night, after the last student left, the shop was silent again. Thomas sat at the table. Eric leaned against the wall. Neither of them spoke for a while. Just the sound of the wind through the rafters and the steady ticking of the old clock by the window. "You were right," Eric said finally. "About what? I thought I was supposed to fix everything, fast, buy my way through guilt, impress you. But that never mattered, did it?" Thomas looked at him, slow and thoughtful. "No. What matters is that you showed up. That you stayed." Eric's eyes dropped. "I'm sorry I didn't before." "I know. It wasn't forgiveness, not the kind found in fairy tales. But it was the truth. And sometimes, the truth is enough." Weeks passed. Then months. The workshop grew. More students. More community. Even a few small commissions. People started referring to it as the Bennett Barn, and Thomas didn't mind. He didn't care about the name. What mattered was the sound of hammers and voices, of something alive blooming from something nearly lost. One morning in late fall, Thomas stood outside the barn. The leaves were red and gold, spinning through the yard like memories. He had grown slower, no doubt about it. The joints ached. The breath came shorter on colder days. But the pride. It was heavy in his chest. And light, all at once. He walked into the shop and saw Eric, sleeves rolled, sawdust on his neck, laughing with a girl who was showing him her first cabinet. Thomas smiled and turned away, not wanting to interrupt. He walked toward the back room. Sat in his old chair. Pulled out his notebook. He flipped through pages and pages, notes, diagrams, measurements, until he reached the very last one. Blank. He picked up a pencil and wrote, slowly, deliberately. "This is the last page. But the story's still being carved." He closed the book. Set it on the bench. And looked around one last time. Everything that mattered was still here. Not the walls. Not the name on the deed. But the boy now grown into a man. The sound of new hands learning. The scent of oak and oil and life. And love. Not spoken but built. Epilogue. Months later, a new plaque was mounted just outside the barn. The Bennett Workshop. Built by hand. Held by heart. And beneath it, in smaller letters. In memory of Thomas Bennett, who taught us how to leave something standing. The first snow fell quietly. It coated the Bennett Workshop roof in a soft white veil, the kind that made the whole world feel hushed, like it was listening. Thomas had been coughing more. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that made him stop. But Eric noticed. He brought tea more often. He added an extra log to the stove even when it wasn't cold. And he watched his father's hands shake just slightly when he carved. Thomas noticed too. But he said nothing. Instead, he spent more time with the notebook, the one that had always been just his. At night, when the workshop was quiet, he'd sit by the small lamp at the back bench and write. Not notes. Not diagrams. Just thoughts. Stories. Memories. A few lines at a time, like he was stitching together something invisible. One morning, Eric arrived early and found the notebook left open on the bench. He hesitated, then sat down. On the page was a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but he knew it was for him. I used to think legacy meant what you built. The walls, the wood, the signed corner of a finished piece. But now I know. It's not what we build. It's what we leave behind when we're no longer holding it up. You dropped it once. But you picked it back up. You chose to stay. That's more than most men do. Eric's hands trembled as he closed the notebook. In the corner of the room, the tools of his grandfather, now polished and resting in perfect order, gleamed under the soft winter light. He felt the weight of them all. The men before him. The men who stayed. The men who came back. Later that week, Thomas asked Eric to take over one of the classes alone. Think they'll listen to me? Eric joked, half serious. They already are, Thomas replied. So Eric taught. Nervous at first. Then stronger. His voice found rhythm. His hands found steadiness. He showed them how to cut mortise joints, how to feel for flaws in the grain, how to trust the process. The students listened. They laughed. They learned. And Thomas watched, not with pride, that had come before, but with peace. That evening, after the students left, Eric poured tea for them both and sat across from his father. Did you mean to leave that letter out? He asked. Thomas smiled faintly. Does it matter? Eric looked down. I don't want to waste time again. You're not. There was silence then. But not the kind that filled space. The kind that said everything else. Outside, the snow kept falling. And inside, for the first time in years, everything felt complete. Winter deepened. Each morning, Eric shoveled the path from the driveway to the workshop before his father arrived. But one day, the coldest yet, Thomas didn't come. Eric waited. He cleaned the tools, reorganized the woodpile, reheated old coffee. But the door didn't creak. The heavy boots didn't step in. Just silence. Real silence. He called. No answer. He drove over. Lights were off. The kettle was cold. He found his father in the bedroom, sitting upright in the old rocker by the window, his eyes closed peacefully, a book in his lap, his glasses resting askew. Gone. Just like that. The funeral was small. He had wanted it that way. No speeches. No long prayers. Just friends, neighbors, students, people whose lives had been touched in quiet, splintered ways. Eric stood off to the side, unsure whether to speak. But when the pastor asked if anyone had words to share, Eric stepped forward. He didn't talk about regrets. He didn't talk about mistakes. He told a story, about a crooked birdhouse, about a fortress with too much glue, about how sometimes love doesn't come as words but as wood passed hand to hand. When he finished, he pulled something from his coat pocket, the page from the notebook. Folded and worn. He read the final lines out loud. You dropped it once. But you picked it back up. You chose to stay. That's more than most men do. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Eric returned to the workshop alone. It smelled the same, cedar, oil, old varnish. But it felt emptier. And yet, he wasn't alone. The work remained. The students returned. And so did Claire and Donna, and the young veteran who'd started carving toys for his daughter. One by one, people filtered back through the barn doors, not because of Thomas, but because of what he left behind. Eric found Thomas's final note tucked inside the tool chest, a folded slip of paper wrapped around a single carving chisel. For when you're ready to start something that's just yours. Eric didn't cry. He picked up the chisel. He walked to the bench. And he began to carve. Not a chair. Not a table. Something different. Something new. Weeks passed. The table Eric had been working on, the very first one he'd ever started with Thomas, sat at the center of the workshop now. Around it, students laughing, learning, failing, sanding, staining. On one wall, a new frame had been hung beside the others. In memory of Thomas Bennett, builder of wood, healer of bonds. But above the door, Eric added something else. Just 4 words, burned into a smooth walnut board. Words his father had once said casually, but that now echoed with truth. Straight lines are overrated. And in that, everything lived on. The shop no longer felt like Thomas's. Not in the way it once did. It wasn't that his presence had faded. If anything, it lingered in every corner. But now, the air carried a different rhythm. Lighter. Fuller. It was no longer a place of old echoes, but of new voices. Eric found himself working later than ever. But it didn't feel like work. He wasn't just teaching techniques anymore. He was passing on something deeper. Patience, craft, stillness. And people came. Young, old, angry, lost. They showed up carrying more than just wood. They brought stories. And left lighter. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the high windows, a teenager named Jonah stood awkwardly near the back table. He'd barely spoken in weeks. Rough home life, Eric had gathered. No confidence. Always hiding under a hoodie. Want to try the lathe? Eric asked. Jonah shrugged. Don't know how. Eric handed him a chisel. Neither did I. Hours passed. The boy didn't leave. By the end of the week, Jonah had carved his first bowl. Imperfect, off-center, but his. When he handed it to Eric, he didn't say anything. Just smiled. Eric nodded. Feels good, doesn't it? Jonah's eyes shimmered. Later that night, Eric stayed behind. He pulled out a blank roll of paper from the supply closet, taped it to the workbench, and stared at it. A blank blueprint. Not for furniture. For the future. He started sketching, not measurements or materials, but ideas. Open workshop Saturdays. No tools required. Story nights. People share what they've built and why. Scholarships for local youth, sponsored by donations and commissions. Partnership with the high school, trade skills for credit. The pencil moved fast. He saw it now, not just a shop, but a sanctuary. A school. A second chance. A place for people to unlearn silence and relearn themselves, the same way he had. And at the very top of the page, in small letters. Inspired by Thomas Bennett, who built more than wood. The next morning, Claire stopped by. She noticed the blueprint immediately. Eric explained everything, nervously at first, then with growing energy. Claire nodded, asked questions, took notes. By the end, she looked him in the eyes and said, "Let's make it real." A month later, the town paper ran a front-page story. From betrayal to blueprints, son rebuilds father's legacy with community project. Photo of Eric holding Jonah's misshapen bowl. Behind them, a classroom full of sawdust, sunshine, and second chances. Spring returned the way it always did in their town, quietly, like someone gently nudging a door open after a long silence. The Bennett workshop buzzed with new life. Teenagers stained their first nightstands. A young mother built a cradle with her father. Veterans came in twice a week to carve walking sticks, swap stories, and forget about pain for a while. But for Eric, one thing remained untouched. The old bench beneath the side window, Thomas's bench. He hadn't sat there once since the funeral. The tools were still laid out the same way his father left them. The small radio, the lamp, the coffee ring stains, the little notches on the edge of the table where Thomas used to sharpen his pencils, marks from years of habit. Eric avoided it. Until one rainy afternoon, when the power went out. The lights died. The machines fell silent. The students packed up early. And Eric was left alone with the sound of the rain on the roof. He made tea. Out of instinct, he carried the mug toward the bench. He paused. Then sat down. The seat creaked. The window fogged slightly with his breath. He looked around and realized, the workshop had changed, yes, but this bench had always been the heart of it. He reached under the bench, to the drawer Thomas always kept locked. It wasn't locked now. Inside, neatly stacked, were dozens of folded papers, letters, diagrams, lists of tools, and a small wooden box. Eric opened it. Inside was a simple hand-carved plaque. Unfinished. Just one word engraved on it. Home. No name. No dates. Just that. He held it in both hands, as the rain came harder. And something in him finally gave way. He cried. Not like a child. Not like a broken man. But like someone letting go of what could never be changed, and finally embracing what remained. That weekend, Eric hosted the first story night. People filled the barn. Donna spoke about the time Thomas fixed her fence during a storm. Claire read from his old notebook, the entry where he first sketched the idea of teaching. Jonah stood up, nervously, and talked about how this place saved his life. And Eric. He brought out the plaque. Held it up. This was his last piece, he said. He didn't finish it. Maybe he didn't need to. He turned it toward the crowd. I think we finish it together, every time we show up. The next morning, Eric mounted the plaque above the bench by the window. Visitors stop there now. They sit. They read. They remember. And above their heads, the word glows in soft morning light. Home. Summer arrived gently. By now, the Bennett workshop had become a living, breathing story, one told in sawdust, soft voices, and wood that remembered every hand that shaped it. Eric was no longer the man who had returned in guilt. He was something else now. A mentor. A builder. A son who had finally learned what it meant to stay. One morning, while organizing supplies in the back room, Eric came across an old voice recorder. Dusty, batteries long dead. He almost tossed it, but something made him pause. He replaced the batteries, pressed play. Static. Then his father's voice. This is Thomas Bennett. I never liked hearing my own voice, but I suppose some things are worth saying out loud. Pause. If you're hearing this, it probably means I'm gone. Or I'm finally done pretending that time doesn't catch up. Soft laugh. Eric, I never needed you to be perfect. I just needed you to be present. You got there. That's enough for me. This place, this shop, it's yours now. Don't protect it. Don't preserve it. Let it grow. Let it become something better than I ever imagined. One day, you'll teach someone who will outwork you, outbuild you, outshine you. Let them. Because legacy isn't in what you leave behind. It's in what you make room for. Eric stood frozen for a long time. Then he carefully placed the recorder back in the drawer. He didn't need to hear more. Not now. He'd carry the rest with him. Weeks later, a city council member visited the shop. They were discussing grants, expansion ideas, and how to replicate the workshop model across the state. It's incredible, the man said. How'd this all start? Eric smiled. He didn't mention betrayal. He didn't mention pain. Instead, he pointed to the worn corner bench and said, "A man once taught me how to build with silence. That's where it started." The last cut Eric ever made with his father's tools was on a simple frame, not ornate, not fancy. Inside it, he placed a photo of the two of them from years ago, standing in front of the original shop, both covered in sawdust, both scowling like they'd just argued. He hung the photo beside the plaque that read home, and beneath it, he carved in quiet letters, "You taught me how to leave something standing." The end. Thank you for spending this time with us. If the story moved you, even a little, let us know. Drop a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after the screen fades. Your support means more than you know.